The Nexus Gate stood in the depths of space, an ancient construct that had eluded all attempts at understanding for millennia. Towering and unyielding, its massive metallic frame hummed with a low-energy pulse, a constant rhythm that reverberated through the surrounding stars. Located in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, it had been dormant for centuries until now. Captain Alara Strake stood on the bridge of the Vanguard, her eyes fixed on the swirling patterns of energy surrounding the Nexus. The vast emptiness of space was alive with an unnatural hum as her crew worked tirelessly to monitor the increasing anomalies. The ship's sensors picked up strange fluctuations, pulses of energy that seemed to ripple through both space and time. Ilara's heart pounded with unease. There was something about the Nexus stirring again that didn't sit right. "Captain, we've got an anomaly forming at the core of the Nexus," Lieutenant Kale reported, his voice tight with tension. Ilara's fingers tapped against the edge of her console as she considered the possibilities. The Nexus had been a focal point of study for centuries, but no one had ever fully understood its purpose. Some believed it was a portal to other dimensions. Others speculated it was a weapon of unimaginable power. Regardless, humanity had established a defensive perimeter around it, and Alara's fleet had been tasked with ensuring it remained untouched until now. "Deploy the outer defense drones," Ilara ordered. "Prepare for potential contact." The Vanguard was a formidable vessel, bristling with advanced weaponry and shielding designed to protect the Nexus from any outside threats. Her crew, a hand-picked team of the finest military minds and scientists, had been trained for this exact moment. But Ilara had never anticipated the situation would escalate so quickly. As her orders were carried out, the anomaly at the Nexus grew in intensity, the energy pulses becoming erratic and violent. The space around it began to warp, bending in unnatural ways. Suddenly, without warning, the gate flared brightly, casting a brilliant light across the void. Ilara's breath caught as a massive rift opened in the fabric of space itself, a rip in reality, wider and more dangerous than any anomaly they had ever encountered. A crackling energy surged outward, and before Ilara could react, something emerged from the breach. It was not a ship, it was not a fleet, it was something much more terrifying. Figures, translucent and shimmering with an otherworldly glow, appeared. They seemed to ripple in and out of existence, their forms barely holding together. As they materialized in full, their eyes, burning like distant stars, locked onto the Vanguard. These were no ordinary invaders. "Ephemeral," Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible. "But how?" The Ephemerals, legendary beings thought to be nothing more than myth, had long been the subject of stories passed down through the centuries. Beings that existed on the edges of reality, made from the very stuff of space-time. For the first time in history, they were real, and they were here. "Captain, we're being scanned," said Dr. Talia Morn, the ship's lead scientist. "They're trying to communicate." Ilara's mind raced. This wasn't just a hostile encounter, it was a potential breakthrough or a catastrophic failure, depending on how they approached it. The Nexus had been dormant for so long. Could this be the result of some kind of external influence? Was this an attack, or was it something more? Whatever the case, humanity had to be ready. "Keep shields up, Lieutenant," Ilara commanded, her eyes narrowing. "We don't know what they want. Prepare to engage if necessary." As the first of the ephemeral entities moved closer, its shimmering form crackled with energy, the very air around it bending under the weight of its presence. Ilara could feel the immense power emanating from the being. It was like standing next to a star on the verge of going supernova, dangerous and yet strangely beautiful. "Warning," Kale's voice rang out. "Their technology, it's beyond anything we've ever encountered. We're not equipped for this." But Ilara didn't take her eyes off the figure. She knew something crucial. This encounter, whatever its outcome, would change everything. There was no turning back. "Contact," Dr. Morn said, her voice shaking. "They're speaking, in our minds." Ilara's heart skipped a beat. The ephemerals weren't just communicating through words. They were speaking directly into her consciousness, bypassing every defense humanity had built to shield against alien influence. "Humanity," the voice whispered, its tone deep, ancient, and echoing in her mind. "You are the key to what comes next." Suddenly, Ilara understood. Whatever was happening now was only the beginning. Ilara's pulse quickened as the words of the ephemeral resonated in her mind. The voice was not just speaking, it was imploring, filled with ancient urgency. Her eyes locked on the shimmering entity in front of the vanguard, feeling a strange pull. The alien's form flickered, like the image of a mirage in the desert, its presence an enigma woven between dimensions. "We are the guardians of the Nexus," the voice continued, calm yet urgent. "The coming tide is unstoppable. Only you, the children of the lost line, can prevent the destruction." Ilara's mind raced, her thoughts scrambling to process the flood of information. She had read the ancient texts about the Nexus and its mysterious guardians, the ephemerals, but they were mere myth, legends passed down through time. The idea that they were now speaking to her, that they had returned, felt like a weight of fate pressing down on her. And yet, there was something far more pressing than the shock of first contact. She could feel it, a deep undercurrent of danger that rippled through her thoughts. "Captain," Lieutenant Kale's voice broke into her reverie, "we're detecting an anomaly in the outer systems. It's massive. There's a fleet coming through the rift." The ephemeral's presence flickered, and for a moment, Ilara wondered if they were even real. She could still hear the voice inside her head, but the alien figure before her was fading, its body becoming translucent. "The Thanatary," the voice whispered as the entity began to fade into the space around them. "They seek to enslave the Nexus. You must act now." The rift in the fabric of reality was widening, tearing open to reveal something even more terrifying than the ephemerals. The dark, malevolent ships of the Thanatary. They emerged from the breach like sharks cutting through the void, their jagged, obsidian hulls gleaming with dark energy. As they flooded into the system, the sheer scale of their armada was enough to shake Ilara to her core. Thousands of ships, each one far more advanced and deadly than anything humanity had ever encountered, stretched across the stars. They had come for the Nexus, and they would stop at nothing to control it. "Alert the fleet," Ilara snapped, her voice calm despite the rising panic in her chest. "Prepare for engagement. Bring the outer defenses online." As her crew scrambled to follow her orders, Ilara felt the weight of responsibility settle over her. This was no ordinary battle. The Thanatary were not just invaders. They were a race of ancient beings, known for their ruthlessness and their pursuit of power. They had once been part of the galaxy's earliest civilizations, but centuries ago, they had disappeared into the shadows of history, leaving only whispers behind. "Captain," Dr. Talia Morn said, her voice tense with disbelief. "The ephemerals, they said humanity is the key, but they didn't explain how. We've never faced anything like this before. The Thanatary have the power to bend space and time to their will. They're going to destabilize the entire system." Ilara's mind raced as the enormity of the situation began to settle in. If the Thanatary succeeded in controlling the Nexus, it wouldn't just be the galaxy at risk, it would be the multiverse itself. The fabric of all realities was bound to the Nexus, and the Thanatary were poised to tear it apart. "How long until they reach the Nexus?" Ilara asked, her voice steady but strained. "Not long," Kale answered, his eyes glued to the screens. "Maybe an hour, if we're lucky. They're moving fast." The sound of distant explosions echoed through the ship as the first waves of Thanatary ships engaged the fleet's outer defenses. Ilara gripped the armrests of her command chair, steeling herself for the battle to come. She couldn't afford to hesitate. The future of the galaxy and of all realities hung in the balance. "We'll hold them off," she said, her voice filled with determination. We won't let them take the Nexus." But even as she spoke, Ilara couldn't shake the feeling that the battle had already been lost before it even began. The Thanatary were too powerful, their knowledge of the Nexus too vast. And what if the ephemerals were right? What if humanity was the only thing standing between the destruction of everything? As the vanguard accelerated toward the heart of the battle, Ilara's mind turned to the next question. What role would humanity play in this fight? And was it already too late to stop the Thanatary? The vanguard tore through the space around the Nexus, Ilara's gaze fixed on the screen as it displayed the advancing Thanatary fleet. Their dark ships moved in perfect formation, their jagged edges glinting like predators' teeth. Her crew was at battle stations, scrambling to defend their position, but Ilara knew that holding the line was only part of the fight. The real challenge was understanding the Nexus, understanding the ephemerals, and why humanity had been drawn into this conflict. As the battle raged outside, Dr. Talia Morn stood at the central console, her face pale with the weight of their discoveries. "Captain, you need to see this," she said, her voice strained. Ilara stood from her command chair, moving quickly to Talia's side. The scientist's hands hovered over the console, her fingers typing in a flurry of commands as she pulled up the holographic display. A map of the Nexus spread across the room, layered and complex, with geometries that seemed impossible to human understanding. The hologram flickered, revealing patterns in the energy surges that matched no known cosmic phenomenon. "What are we looking at?" Ilara asked, studying the strange map. Talia pointed to a small, glowing symbol in the center of the Nexus. "This," she said, her voice tight with awe. "It's a key, Captain. A key to the Nexus' true purpose." Ilara furrowed her brow. "A key?" Talia nodded. "The Nexus doesn't just connect different dimensions. It's a mechanism designed to maintain balance across all of them. It's a stabilizer, holding the fabric of reality together. But it's also a weapon, one that can reset everything." Ilara's pulse quickened. Reset everything. Talia's fingers trembled as she zoomed in on another part of the map, showing vast, interconnected realms, some filled with strange constellations, others with swirling energy storms. The ephemerals warned us about this. The Thanatary aren't just after power, they want to control the Nexus, reshape it to their will. If they succeed, they could destroy entire dimensions, entire galaxies. Every version of reality would be at risk. "Why us?" Ilara asked, voice tight. "Why is humanity involved in this?" Dr. Morn hesitated. "The prophecy." Ilara's heart skipped a beat. The prophecy of the Nexus had been a legend, a myth told among the ancient archives, long before she had ever set foot on the battlefield. It was said that humanity was destined to be the keepers of the Nexus, the only species capable of preventing the multiversal collapse. "The prophecy tells of a chosen race," Talia continued, "the guardians of the Nexus. It says that only the children of the ancient creators, those who once forged the bridge between realms, can control it. That's humanity." Ilara felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. Humanity? The creators of the Nexus? That didn't make sense. Her ancestors hadn't been gods. They had been survivors, pioneers who had fled from some cataclysmic event and established themselves as the dominant species of a young, unstable galaxy. "How is this possible?" Ilara asked, her voice rising in frustration. "Our ancestors didn't build this. The Nexus is older than humanity's first steps in the stars." Talia paused, turning toward Ilara with a knowing look. "The truth is buried deeper than we thought. Humanity didn't create the Nexus, but our ancestors were chosen to protect it. They were once part of an ancient alliance, a coalition of species that created the Gateway. When the Thanatary tried to seize the Nexus thousands of years ago, your ancestors were the ones who sealed it away. They sealed themselves away too, in a sense, to keep the Thanatary from controlling the gate." Ilara's mind reeled with the implications. The ephemerals hadn't just come to warn them. They had come because humanity was the last line of defense. The legacy of her ancestors, hidden in the shadows of time, was now an inescapable reality. If we are the Guardians, then why didn't we know? Elara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Talia's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of fear and understanding. Because the Nexus chose us, Captain. But it's been waiting for the right moment to awaken, to test humanity's resolve, to see if we are truly worthy of the responsibility. Elara's heart thundered in her chest. The Thanatary were close now. The galaxy was on the brink of war, and humanity's true purpose, the reason for their very existence, had just been revealed to her in the most unimaginable way. The Nexus must be protected, Elara said, the weight of her words sinking in. And we are the ones who must do it. We don't have a choice. But first, we need to understand its full power. As the alarms blared, signaling the first strike of the Thanatary ships against the Nexus defenses, Elara knew that the time for hesitation had passed. The legacy of the Guardians had awoken, and humanity would face its destiny, whether it was ready or not. The Vanguard shuddered under the first blast of Thanatary weaponry. The ship's hull groaned in protest as shields flared bright, absorbing the blow. Alarms blared throughout the vessel as red lights flickered on the bridge, bathing the crew in an ominous glow. The battle had begun in earnest. Elara stood at the center of the bridge, her hand clenched around the armrest of her chair. The display in front of her showed the Thanatary fleet closing in rapidly on the Nexus, their massive ships forming an impenetrable wall. The Nexus itself seemed to pulse in response to the encroaching darkness, its energy surging in waves. The anomalies surrounding it were growing stronger, more erratic, as though the very fabric of reality was buckling under the pressure. Captain, we've lost contact with the outer defense stations, Lieutenant Kale reported, his voice tight with urgency. They're being overrun. The Thanatary have deployed ground forces on the surface of the Nexus. What? Elara's heart sank. They're attacking the Nexus directly? Cal's expression grimaced as the gravity of the situation hit him. Yes, Captain. They're sending assault teams. We've never seen anything like it. Their technology, it's bypassing our defenses. We're not equipped for this. Elara's mind raced. The Thanatary weren't just attacking with conventional forces. They were using something far more dangerous, something that could destabilize the very fabric of the Nexus itself. The rift in space was growing larger by the minute, and the power emanating from it was shifting from a steady hum to an almost deafening roar. We need to stop them before they breach the Nexus, Elara said, her voice unwavering despite the panic bubbling beneath the surface. Prepare to engage the fleet. Target their capital ships. We'll have to slow them down long enough to take back control of the Nexus. Her officers scrambled to follow her orders, but Elara's thoughts were elsewhere, torn between the battle unfolding outside and the terrible truth revealed inside her own mind. Humanity's role in the struggle was no longer a matter of survival, it was a matter of legacy. The ephemerals had spoken of the chosen race, but now she realized just how much was at stake. If the Thanatary succeeded, if they managed to bend the Nexus to their will, the entire multiverse could collapse. The fabric of reality itself could unravel. Captain, Talia Morn said from the console, I've detected something strange in the Nexus energy readings. It's a signal, but it's not coming from any known frequency. It's almost like it's being activated. Elara's brow furrowed. Activated? By who? Talia's fingers flew over the controls as she attempted to analyze the signal. It's the Nexus itself. It's responding to the Thanatary incursion. But there's something else, something hidden in the signal. Before she could finish, the bridge was rocked by another explosion. The lights flickered and alarms screamed. A second wave of Thanatary ships emerged from the rift, their weapons now focusing on the Vanguard. We've got incoming, Kale shouted. They're breaking through our outer defense line. Captain, we're not going to be able to hold them off for much longer. Ilara's mind raced. If they didn't act soon, the Vanguard would be overwhelmed, and the Nexus would fall into the hands of the Thanatary. She had no illusions about the Thanatary's goals. They weren't just looking to conquer a star system. They wanted to control the Nexus, the key to the multiverse. But there was a chance. If they could disrupt the Thanatary forces long enough, buy time to decode the Nexus signal, they might just find a way to turn the tide. She glanced at Talia, her eyes narrowing with resolve. Talia, what do you need to decode that signal? The scientist swallowed hard. We need to access the central control system of the Nexus. There's a hidden core that I believe holds the key to unlocking its power. But it's deep beneath the surface, in the heart of the Nexus itself. Ilara didn't hesitate. I'll lead a team down to the surface. We'll get to that core. Talia's eyes widened. Captain, that's insane. The Thanatary are already entrenched on the surface. It's a suicide mission. Ilara turned to face her, her expression set in stone. Then we'll make it count. We're not just fighting for our galaxy, Talia. We're fighting for all of reality. As the battle raged on outside the Vanguard, Ilara quickly assembled a team, elite soldiers and scientists, all ready to risk everything to prevent the Thanatary from reaching the heart of the Nexus. She couldn't afford to let them control the key to the multiverse. The countdown was on. As the team prepared for deployment, Ilara looked out at the chaos in space. The fate of countless worlds rested on the success of their mission. They had no time to lose. Let's move out, she ordered, her voice steady. With a deep breath, Ilara and her team suited up, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them on the surface of the Nexus. The battle for the future of the galaxy and the multiverse had just begun. The Vanguard shuddered again as another volley of Thanatary fire struck its shields. Ilara's gaze remained fixed on the dark expanse of space outside the viewport, her thoughts focused on the mission ahead. She couldn't afford to waste a second. The surface of the Nexus was an unknown, a world of ancient power and hidden dangers. But if they didn't make it to the core, if they couldn't access the hidden systems controlling the Nexus itself, the Thanatary would succeed in their conquest. Her team was ready. The airlock hissed open, and Ilara stepped into the cramped shuttle, her crew following close behind. Talia, Lieutenant Kale, and a small group of engineers and soldiers made up the elite team tasked with infiltrating the surface. They had to navigate the shifting energy fields surrounding the Nexus, and if the Thanatary had already breached the planet's surface, they would be in for a fight. The shuttle's engines roared to life, and they descended through the atmosphere of the Nexus. The view from the viewport was like something out of a nightmare. Vast, swirling energy storms clashed in the sky, and the ground below was covered in strange, glowing markings, as though the planet itself was alive, pulsing with ancient energy. Talia's voice crackled over the comms. Captain, the readings are off the charts. The Nexus's energy is warping around us. We'll need to be careful. The landscape is unstable. I'll take the lead, Ilara said, her voice steady as ever. Kale, you're with me. Talia, stay in the shuttle and keep the comms open. The shuttle landed with a jarring thud, the dust of the surface rising in clouds around them. Ilara felt the ground tremble beneath her boots as she stepped out, scanning the environment for any sign of movement. The landscape was bizarre. Rock formations that seemed to defy the laws of physics, twisting and bending, as though the fabric of reality itself was bending around the Nexus's core. Stay sharp, Ilara said, her voice low as she drew her weapon, ready for whatever awaited them. The team moved out in a tight formation, Kel's sharp eyes scanning the terrain, while the rest of the crew followed closely behind. The deeper they ventured, the more alien the environment became. The ground pulsed with strange energy, and the air was thick with an unsettling hum. Every step felt like walking through an alien dream, the very fabric of space around them seeming to warp and shimmer. Captain, over here. Kale's voice cut through the tension. He had spotted something in the distance, a massive structure, towering and angular, unlike anything Alara had ever seen before. It resembled a temple, but it was unlike anything from any known civilization. The walls were etched with glowing symbols, some of which seemed to pulse with an eerie, sentient rhythm. "That's it," Alara said, determination in her voice. "The Nexus core has to be inside." They made their way to the entrance, a vast doorway etched with more of the same glowing runes. As Alara approached, the symbol seemed to react, shifting in response to her presence. She hesitated for a moment, but then pushed forward, the door sliding open with a low, resonating hum. Inside was a vast chamber, far larger than the temple's exterior had suggested. The air was heavy with the weight of ancient power. At the center of the room stood a massive crystalline structure, its surface glowing with a soft, pulsing light. Alara could feel the energy emanating from it, like the beating heart of the Nexus itself. "This is it," Talia whispered, awe and fear mingling in her voice. "The core, it's more than I imagined." Alara took a step forward, drawn to the crystal at the heart of the chamber. As her hand brushed against the surface, a surge of energy shot through her, overwhelming her senses. A flood of visions, ancient civilizations, the rise and fall of galaxies, the catastrophic battles for control of the Nexus, flashed before her eyes. She saw the Thanatary, their dark ships spreading like a plague, their relentless hunger for power. She saw humanity, standing as the last line of defense, their legacy hidden within the very fabric of the Nexus. In that moment, she understood the truth. Humanity wasn't just the last hope. It was the key to the Nexus itself. The ancient creators had embedded their power into the human race, passed down through generations, waiting for this moment. The Nexus was an extension of them, a force that could reshape reality, but only if wielded by the ones who truly understood it. "Captain, we need to act now," Kale's voice broke through the visions, dragging Alara back to the present. "The Thanatary are coming." The ground shook violently as the distant sound of Thanatary forces advanced toward the temple. They were closing in fast. Alara snapped back into action, pulling away from the crystal. "We need to activate it. Now." Talia stepped forward, her fingers dancing across the symbols etched into the chamber's walls. "The activation sequence is complex, Captain. It will take a few minutes." "No time," Alara said, her voice steady. "We don't have a few minutes. We need to end this now." With a final glance at the glowing crystal, Alara prepared for the worst. The Thanatary were coming, and the fate of the Nexus, and the multiverse, rested on the choices she made in the next few moments. The ground trembled beneath Alara's boots, a constant reminder of the Thanatary forces closing in. The temple's walls hummed with ancient energy as Talia worked furiously at the control interface. Each second felt like an eternity as the team braced for what was to come. Kale stood by the entrance, his weapon aimed at the dark corridors beyond. The shadows seemed to stretch and pulse, the warping energy of the Nexus distorting everything around them. His eyes darted from side to side, every sense on high alert. "They're getting closer, Captain. I don't know how much longer we can hold this position." "We don't have much of a choice," Alara replied, her voice cold and focused. She turned her gaze back to Talia, who was sweating as her fingers danced across the glowing runes, unlocking the sequence that would supposedly activate the Nexus's power. "How much longer, Talia?" Alara asked, her patience wearing thin. Talia didn't look up, but her voice trembled as she responded. "I'm almost there, but the core systems are more complex than anything we've ever encountered. There's a built-in failsafe. If it detects an unauthorized activation, it cooled." Before Talia could finish, a deafening crash echoed through the temple, followed by the shrill screech of the Thanatary's weapons. The door to the chamber buckled as a heavy impact sent it flying open. A dozen Thanatary soldiers stormed into the room, their dark armor gleaming in the eerie light, their weapons trained on the human defenders. "Hold the line," Alara shouted, drawing her own sidearm and moving toward the front. Her team responded with deadly precision, gunfire filling the air as they fanned out, engaging the Thanatary with every ounce of training they had. Kale opened fire first, his shots piercing the first wave of invaders with pinpoint accuracy. Alara followed, moving swiftly with the fluid grace of a warrior honed by countless battles. The sound of plasma blasts and gunfire echoed in the chamber, the air thick with the scent of ozone. The Thanatary soldiers were formidable, their energy shields absorbing most of the fire, but they were not invincible. Alara's mind remained focused, her heart pounding in sync with the battle's rhythm. She couldn't afford distractions. The Nexus must be activated, and it must happen now. Every shot she fired, every movement she made was in service of that singular goal. "Captain," Kale called out, his voice sharp with urgency. He took down another Thanatary soldier, but the enemy was pressing hard. "We're being overwhelmed. We need to get out of here now." "We won't run," Alara growled, standing her ground. "We're staying until Talia activates the core. We hold them off." Talia's fingers were moving faster now, her voice strained with concentration. "I'm close, just a few more seconds. Stay focused." The Thanatary were closing in, their numbers growing with each passing moment. Alara could hear the heavy footsteps of their larger, more dangerous war machines coming down the hallway. The air felt charged, as if reality itself were about to snap. There was no retreat, no fallback position to speak of. This was it. If they didn't succeed, the Nexus would fall, and with it, the fate of the multiverse. Suddenly, a massive Thanatary war machine appeared in the doorway, a hulking brute of metal and energy, its weapons blazing as it entered the chamber. Its armor was nearly impervious to their standard weapons, and it tore through their ranks with devastating force. "Kale, take it down," Alara shouted, darting to the side as a blast from the war machine narrowly missed her. "I'll try," Kale shouted back, launching a grenade directly at the war machine. It hit with a brilliant flash of light, but the explosion barely made a dent. The war machine's shield flickered, but it remained intact. Alara's eyes narrowed. This was their final test. If they didn't stop this machine, they'd be out of time. She sprinted toward it, using the chaos as cover, her mind racing. The war machine turned its weapon toward her, and in that instant, Alara knew she had one shot. Her training, her instincts, everything she had learned up to this moment came together in a single fluid motion. She leaped onto the machine's massive foot, using her momentum to propel herself upward, scaling its armored leg with precision. The machine attempted to shake her off, but Alara clung tightly, her blade drawn. With a final powerful strike, she sliced through a vital power conduit in its side. Sparks flew, and the machine stumbled, its systems malfunctioning as it collapsed to the ground with a thunderous crash. "Target down," Kale shouted, relief flooding his voice. But Alara didn't have time to savor the victory. The battle was far from over. The Thanatary were relentless, and they still had one final task to complete. "Talia, now," Alara called. The scientist's face was a mask of sweat and exhaustion, but her hands flew over the control panel. "I've done it," she gasped. "The core is activated. The Nexus is responding." Suddenly, the temple itself seemed to shake with a violent tremor, the air crackling with raw energy. The walls of the chamber shifted, their glowing runes pulsing brighter and faster. A brilliant beam of light shot upward from the Nexus core, and the entire room seemed to distort as the energies of the Nexus flooded the temple. "The failsafe is engaging," Talia warned. "We need to get out of here now." Alara's heart raced as she turned to face her team. The Nexus was awakening, but at what cost? The power was rising uncontrollably, and they had only seconds before it would become too unstable to survive. "Move," she ordered, leading the team toward the exit, but the doorway was blocked by a final wave of Thanatary soldiers, their weapons raised, ready for the kill. The battle wasn't over yet. The real fight had just begun. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest as she and her team raced toward the exit, the Nexus core's light now blinding in its intensity. The walls around them seemed to warp, as if the very reality of the temple was being pulled apart by the surge of energy. She could hear the crackling hum of the Nexus's power, a sound both thrilling and terrifying. The Thanatary soldiers had regrouped, blocking their path to the shuttle and escape. "Get to the door," Ilara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The glowing runes on the walls flickered, each pulse of light sending shivers through the air. It was as if the Nexus itself was waking up, responding to their presence. Or perhaps it was responding to the Thanatary. Either way, it was clear that time was running out. Kale and the others moved swiftly, firing as they went. The Thanatary were relentless, their superior armor and firepower pushing back against the human defenders. But Ilara could see the exhaustion in their eyes. They had been fighting for hours, and the battlefield outside the temple was no different. The Thanatary were advancing everywhere, seeking to claim the heart of the Nexus and bring the multiverse to its knees. "We can't hold them off forever," Talia called from behind, her voice strained as she continued to run. The weight of the situation was pressing down on them all. "We need to get to the shuttle and leave before this place collapses." Ilara's gaze flicked over her shoulder to the temple's central chamber, where the Nexus's energy was reaching catastrophic levels. The glowing light from the core intensified, filling the room with a blinding radiance. The power surging from the core was no longer just a hum, it was a roar, a deafening pulse that reverberated through their very bones. The fail-safe Talia had spoken of was activating, and the Nexus itself was responding in kind. "I know," Ilara replied through gritted teeth. "But we're not leaving until the Nexus is secure. The Thanatary can't take it. Not after everything we've sacrificed to get here." Another round of plasma fire blasted through the air, narrowly missing Talia. She yelped and dove to the ground as the team returned fire. The door was just ahead, but it was increasingly clear that they weren't going to make it without a fight. The Thanatary were closing in from all sides. "Ilara!" Kale's voice rang out, strained with urgency. "We need to go, now." Ilara glanced around, her mind racing. The path to the shuttle was almost clear, but they were surrounded. And with the Nexus's energy escalating, she could feel the walls of reality itself shaking. The entire temple seemed to be shifting, warping under the pressure. Then she saw it. A dark, swirling tear in space just beyond the temple doors. The rift. The opening that the Thanatary had used to breach the Nexus in the first place. It was expanding, growing larger by the second. The power of the Nexus itself was bleeding into the rift, and the Thanatary were going to use it to tear apart the multiverse, spreading their influence everywhere. "We need to close the rift," Ilara said, her voice cold with determination. Talia stopped in her tracks, eyes wide. "Close the rift? We can't. The Nexus, if we try, it could destroy us all. The rift is already destabilizing everything. If we don't do something now, we'll lose this entire reality. We have to risk it." Kale was already moving toward the rift, his weapon raised as he led the way. "I don't like this, Captain, but if it's the only option, let's do it." With no time to waste, Ilara turned toward the rift. The world seemed to bend around it, gravity warping and the air thick with unnatural energy. They needed to stabilize it before the Nexus's power completely collapsed and everything tore itself apart. "On me," Ilara barked. "We'll fight our way to the rift. Talia, stay close, we're going to need you." Talia nodded, fear flashing in her eyes. "I'll do what I can, but I don't know how much longer the Nexus will stay intact." The team surged forward, firing at the Thanatary soldiers blocking their way. Ilara's gunfire was precise, each shot taking down an enemy soldier, but they were still outnumbered. The air was thick with energy, and every step they took felt as if it could be their last. As they neared the rift, Ilara could see the swirling blackness more clearly, a swirling vortex of energy, full of darkness and power. The Thanatary were not far behind, and Alara knew they had mere minutes before they would be overwhelmed. The very air felt heavier, as if reality itself was beginning to collapse around them. Kale reached the edge of the rift first, his rifle raised, scanning for threats. Alara joined him, her eyes locked on the swirling mass of energy before them. "We're almost there," Kale said, his voice tight. "Now what do we do?" Talia approached, holding out a small device, the last hope to seal the rift. She began to work on it frantically, trying to find the right sequence to stabilize the Nexus's energies. The ground shook again, more violently this time, and the temple began to crumble. The rift was pulling everything toward it, time, space, even light itself. The Thanatary were closing in fast, their heavy steps echoing behind them. "Get ready," Alara shouted. "We'll need to hold them off just a bit longer." As Talia worked, Alara braced for the inevitable fight. She had one last mission, to ensure the rift didn't destroy everything they had fought for. The final battle for the fate of the galaxy and the multiverse was about to begin. The temple's walls groaned under the pressure of the Nexus's unstable energy, and the ground bucked as the rift continued to widen. The darkness of the rift swirled and writhed, pulling in everything around it, distorting space itself. Alara could feel the very air compressing, as if reality was being stretched too thin. Every breath she took seemed to weigh more than the last, the tension in the atmosphere palpable. Talia worked feverishly at the device in her hands, her face pale with the effort. Sweat dripped down her forehead as she muttered to herself, trying to stabilize the chaotic energy. This is too much," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "I can't keep it under control. If we don't stop it now, then we all die," Alara finished for her, her voice harsh but calm. The truth was as clear as the impending storm outside. Failure meant the end of everything. The Thanatary would tear through the rift and spread their control across countless realities. Every world, every universe would fall. As if on cue, a roar sounded from the depths of the temple. The Thanatary war machines had arrived. Their massive forms thundered toward them, their weapons charged and ready to fire. Alara raised her weapon, aiming for the closest one, but it was only a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. The rift, now massive, twisted and crackled with dark energy, pulling everything toward its dark maw. Kale's voice came through the comms, his tone sharp. "Alara, we need to hold them off. I'll take the right flank. You cover the left." "Got it," Alara replied, not taking her eyes off the rift. "Talia, how long?" "Seconds." Talia's voice was tight, panicked. "I'm almost there. I just need a little longer." Alara nodded, then turned her attention back to the approaching Thanatary. Her team was spread out, their fire lighting up the temple's otherwise dark and warped interior. The war machines loomed closer, their massive guns charging, ready to unleash destruction. "Do not let them reach the rift," Alara commanded, firing as she advanced. The first shots rang out, and the air was filled with the crackle of plasma. Kale's gunfire was deadly and precise, the heavy impacts of his shots taking down several Thanatary soldiers at once. But it wasn't enough. For every soldier that fell, two more seemed to appear, their relentless assault pushing the humans back. Alara could feel the rift tugging at her, the energy of the Nexus pulling on her senses, distorting her vision. She could see flashes of other worlds through the swirling blackness, horrible futures, twisted possibilities, where the Thanatary had already won. But she didn't let it distract her. They had no time for fear. She fired again, dropping another soldier, then ducked behind a broken pillar as the air was filled with the sound of incoming fire. Her heart pounded, her muscles burned with the effort, but she didn't relent. Every shot was a moment closer to victory, or doom. Talia's voice cut through the chaos, filled with strained relief. "I've done it. The rift, it's closing, it's stabilizing." Alara's breath caught in her chest as the rift began to shrink, the swirling energy slowing and then folding in on itself. The rumbling of the ground subsided and the unstable atmosphere seemed to settle. But the victory felt hollow, knowing they had only moments to secure it. "We're not out of this yet," Kale shouted from his position. "The Thanatary are still pressing. They'll come for the core." Elara's mind raced. The rift was sealed, but the Nexus was still an unstable force. The Thanatary would never stop until they destroyed it, and they were too close to the heart of the Nexus to be allowed to succeed. There was only one solution left. "Everyone, fall back," Elara ordered, but it was clear they couldn't retreat, not all of them. Kale and Talia met her gaze, knowing what had to be done. Elara glanced at the device that had stabilized the rift. It was the only thing keeping the Nexus from collapsing in on itself. The Thanatary would find it, and they would use it against them. She couldn't let that happen. "Kale, Talia, cover me. I'm going to make sure this place stays sealed." They understood immediately. Kale nodded, already raising his weapon to cover Elara's back. Talia's expression was a mix of fear and resolve, her hands shaking but steady as she turned toward the back of the temple. "Don't do anything reckless, Elara," Kale said, his voice a rare mixture of concern and command. "We still need you." "I know," she said, locking eyes with him. "This is the only way." With a final nod, Elara sprinted toward the Nexus core. The ground trembled beneath her, but she didn't stop. As she reached the center, she placed her hand on the ancient device, feeling the pulse of the energy coursing through her fingertips. She could feel its power, its weight. It was humanity's inheritance, a legacy long forgotten. She had to make sure it didn't fall into the wrong hands. As the Thanatary forces closed in, Elara activated the core's final protocol. The Nexus responded with a deafening roar, its energy surging outward. The temple trembled violently, then exploded outward in a burst of light and force, sending the Thanatary soldiers flying. The world around Elara shifted. In the blink of an eye, the Nexus consumed everything in its wake, its energy cleansing the temple of the invaders and sealing the reality. The rift was gone, the Nexus was secure. But Elara knew it was not without a cost. As the temple disintegrated around her, she only had one thought. Humanity had survived, and the Thanatary would never be able to reach the Nexus again. She closed her eyes, the light from the core consuming everything.